You're a hunter-gatherer, 13,000 years ago, standing in a cave in what will someday be called Israel. No fridge, no corner store, no happy hour. You've walked all day, your feet ache, and someone hands you a bowl of grain. That's been soaking a little too long. It smells strange. It looks alive. And against every survival instinct you have, you drink it anyway. That one reckless sip may have helped build civilization itself. So, when did we start drinking, and why did we ever begin? The answer goes back further than you think. And it doesn't start with people, it starts with monkeys. Here's the thing, nobody tells you about your love of a cold drink. It didn't start with you. It didn't even start with humans. To find where it really began, you have to go back about 10 million years, long before fire, language, or standing upright. And you have to begin with a simple question. Was your body ever actually built to handle alcohol in the first place? For most animals on Earth, the answer is a hard no. When a typical creature swallows a real dose of ethanol, its body basically panics. It can't break the stuff down fast enough, sometimes fatally. For most of the animal kingdom, alcohol is poison, plain and simple. But you are not most animals. You and every ape and monkey you're distantly related to carry a special tool inside your body. It's an enzyme with a clunky name, alcohol dehydrogenase 4, and it breaks down ethanol with surprising speed. Your body comes factory equipped to process booze. And here's the part that should stop you cold. That enzyme didn't show up when someone invented wine, or when farming began. It appeared roughly 10 million years ago, deep in the primate family tree, right around the time our ancestors were climbing down from the trees. So, long before you ever ordered your first drink, your body was quietly getting ready for the relationship. A biologist at the University of California, Berkeley, named Robert Dudley, gave this puzzle 25 years of his life. And the theory he landed on has, hands down, the greatest name in the history of science. He calls it the drunken monkey hypothesis. The idea is beautifully simple. Your ancient primate ancestors ate fruit, a main source of calories, for millions of years. And here's the catch. When fruit gets truly, perfectly ripe, it starts to ferment. Wild yeast lands on the surface, eats the sugars inside, and releases a little ethanol as a byproduct. That means every perfectly ripe piece of fruit came with a faint boozy smell baked right in. Now think about what that smell meant. To a hungry animal in the forest, it wasn't a warning. It was a dinner bell. That scent said, this fruit is at peak ripeness, peak sweetness, peak calories. So eat it now before someone else does. The ancestors who chased that smell ate better, survived longer, and had more children. And they passed that craving straight down the line to you. But maybe you're thinking, this is all just a nice story. Scientists thought so too. So they tested it. In Panama, researchers followed wild spider monkeys and collected the exact fruit they chose to eat. It regularly contained 1 to 2% alcohol, straight from natural fermentation, and the monkey's urine held the leftovers of processed ethanol. A separate study of wild chimpanzees found they took in the equivalent of 1 or 2 human drinks a day, just by eating normally. Your ancestors were getting a gentle buzz in the forest, and they had absolutely no idea. The world's first happy hour, and no one even knew it. Which raises the real question. When did one of us finally stop waiting for nature and decide to make this stuff on purpose? So here's where the story takes a genuinely staggering turn. For millions of years, our ancestors just stumbled onto fermented fruit by accident. But at some point, one of us looked at that bubbling, half-spoiled mess and thought, I want to make that happen on purpose. And that is a completely different kind of leap. It takes memory, patience, and something that looks a lot like early science. So, when did we first pull it off? The oldest solid evidence sits inside a cave in what is now northern Israel. It's called Rakafet Cave in the hills near Haifa. And the people who left that evidence behind have a name. We call them the Natufians. They were semi-nomadic hunter-gatherers who lived across the eastern Mediterranean, somewhere between roughly 15,000 and 11,500 years ago. And these were not simple people. They kept dogs as companions, and they were us, just earlier. Inside that burial cave, alongside human remains, researchers found large stone mortars, bowls that still held a faint residue after 13,000 years. And when a team led by the Stanford archaeologist Li Lu studied that residue under a microscope, the picture that came back was almost impossible to argue with. These people had been making beer, not wine. Beer, brewed from wheat and barley, through a real three-step process. First, they sprouted the grain in water. Then they mashed it and heated it. Then they left it to ferment, with wild yeast drifting in from the open air. That is an intentional, sophisticated recipe, and they were running it 13,000 years ago. Now here's the detail. That should quietly rearrange your brain. This happened before farming. The Natufians did not plant crops. They gathered wild grain straight from the landscape, and instead of just eating all of it, they set some aside to brew, on purpose, for their dead. And that single fact has kicked off one of the most delicious debates in all of archaeology. What if humans didn't settle down and start farming just to make bread, but at least partly to guarantee a steady supply of beer? This is the famous beer before bread idea, championed by the archaeologist Brian Hayden. Why give up a decent nomadic life to break your back-tilling soil unless the payoff was a reliable, calorie-rich, mildly buzzy drink that was safer than the local water and brought everyone together at a feast? Plenty of experts still argue bread came first, and beer was just a happy side effect. But the evidence increasingly points the same way. People may well have been brewing before they were farming. And let that really sink in. The oldest intentional drink on Earth was not invented by farmers, or kings, or city builders. It was made by nomads, in a cave, surrounded by the bodies of the people they loved. From the very first sip, alcohol was never about a good time. It was about something sacred, a pattern about to show up again and again on the other side of the planet, beside a river in ancient China. So let's cross the planet, because here's what makes this story truly strange. The Natufians weren't a one-off fluke. Around the world, in places that had never heard of each other, people kept landing on the exact same idea. Travel east, all the way to the Yellow River Valley in China, to a village called Jiahu. About 9,000 years ago, the people there were already brewing. A team led by the molecular archaeologist Patrick McGovern studied the residue inside their old pottery jars, and what he found was basically an ancient cocktail, a mixed, fermented drink of rice, honey, and hawthorn fruit. Sweet, boozy, and shockingly complex for something made 9,000 years ago. But Jiahu has one more secret, and it might be the most important of all. The people there figured out how to use mold to kickstart fermentation. They learned that certain fungi could break down the tough starches in grain and speed the whole process up. That single trick is the direct ancestor of the method still used today to make sake, rice wine, and dozens of other drinks across East Asia. When you pour a cup of sake tonight, you are drinking the descendant of a 9,000-year-old idea. Now, jump west again, to the country of Georgia, tucked between the Black Sea and the mountains. In a small village there, archaeologists found clay jars that still carried the chemical fingerprint of fermented grapes, dating back about 8,000 years. That is the oldest confirmed wine anywhere on Earth. And Georgians still make it the ancient way, in big clay vessels buried right in the ground. Ask any Georgian who invented wine, and they'll tell you with total confidence that they did. And trust me, this is not a debate you will win. So step back and look at the map. China, Georgia, the Eastern Mediterranean. These cultures were not talking to each other. There were entire oceans and mountain ranges, and thousands of miles between them. And yet, within the same rough window of prehistory, they all arrived at the same discovery, completely on their own. And that tells you something profound. Fermentation is not some lucky accident that happened once and slowly spread from a single spot. It is something humans find over and over. Give people grain, or fruit, or honey. A little water, a little time, and a little curiosity. And sooner or later, they will turn it into something that gives them a buzz. Wherever there are humans, there will eventually be a drink, which means the urge you feel isn't cultural or regional. It's baked into the species. And once a few clever societies learned to do it reliably, one of them was about to take the whole thing, somewhere nobody could have predicted, turning a drink into money, into law, and into a goddess. So, one civilization took this drink and did something no one had ever done before. They didn't just brew it, they built an entire society around it. Welcome to Mesopotamia, the land between two great rivers, in what is now Iraq. The Sumerians, then the Babylonians, the people who gave us writing itself. Some of the very first things humans ever wrote down were not poems, prayers, or laws. They were receipts for beer. The hard evidence goes back a long way. At a site called Godin Tepe in the mountains of western Iran, chemists found the crystallized residue of beer fermentation, preserved inside ancient clay pots, dating to around 3,500 years before the Common Era. But Mesopotamia didn't just drink. Mesopotamia organized drinking. Here's how deep it went. In Sumer, workers were paid in beer as their actual wages. Part of your paycheck came as beer, about half a gallon a day for a typical worker. Imagine your boss handing you half a gallon of beer every afternoon and calling it compensation. In ancient Sumer, that was just a normal Tuesday. Beer was wages, beer was medicine, beer was part of religion, and the Sumerians loved it so much that they gave it a goddess. Her name was Ninkasi, which roughly translates to the lady who fills the mouth, which is honestly a perfect name. She was a major deity, and her domain was the whole civilizing magic of turning plain grain into something that lifted the spirit. But here's where it gets really wild. Around 1800 years before the Common Era, an anonymous poet wrote a hymn in her honor. And that hymn is one of the most remarkable documents to survive from the ancient world. Because on the surface, it's a love song to a goddess. But hidden inside its verses is something else entirely. Step by step, it describes how to actually brew the beer. The soaking, the baking of a special bread, the fermenting, the straining. It is, quite literally, a religious poem that doubles as a recipe. And we know it works because someone tried it. Back in 1989, an American brewer named Fritz Maytag, founder of Anchor Brewing in San Francisco, followed that ancient hymn and recreated the beer. A recipe written almost 4,000 years ago. Still worked. Then came the Babylonians, who took it even further. They cataloged dozens of different kinds of beer: light, dark, filtered, spiced, sweetened with honey. An entire menu of styles at a time when most of humanity was still figuring out farming. And here's my favorite part. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest written law codes on Earth, actually included rules about beer. It set standards for taverns and regulated the fair prices they could charge. And if a tavern owner got caught watering down the beer to cheat their customers, the punishment was severe. Humanity's very first great legal code included consumer protection for your drink. So by now, a fermented accident had become currency, medicine, religion, and law. But there was one more role left for it to play, maybe the oldest and deepest of them all, because in another great civilization, along a different river, a drink was about to become a doorway to the afterlife itself. So follow that river to Egypt, where a drink became something holy. The Egyptians embraced both beer and wine, and both sat right at the center of their world, their religion, their daily meals, and their journey into the next life. Start with beer, because in Egypt, beer was basically survival. The workers who raised the pyramids, and yes, they were paid laborers, not slaves, that myth was dismantled decades ago, received daily rations of beer and bread as the core of their diet and their pay. Egyptian beer was thick and hearty, brewed mostly from wheat, and low in alcohol, by anything you'd recognize today. We know its recipe in detail because Delwyn Samuel, an archaeologist at Cambridge, rebuilt the ancient brewing process under the microscope, grain by grain. The very drink you now save for a Friday night out was, back then, a basic part of what an entire nation ate and drank to get through the day. Then there was wine, and wine was status. Wine was for the powerful, for grand ceremonies, for gifts laid before the gods, and for the sealed tombs of the pharaohs. And here's a detail that should genuinely amaze you. When archaeologists open royal Egyptian tombs, they find wine jars that were carefully labeled, not just with the year, but the specific vineyard it came from, and sometimes even who oversaw it. These are the oldest wine labels in the world, sitting quietly in the dark for 3,000 years. If you've ever turned a bottle around to read the region and vintage before buying, you're doing exactly what a pharaoh's servant did. To the Egyptians, this was no small thing. They believed the gift of beer came from Osiris himself, the god of the dead and of resurrection, not as a vice, but as a gift that helped make people civilized in the first place. And now, step all the way back because a pattern has been quietly forming this entire time. The Natufians brewing beer in a burial cave for their dead. The Sumerians building a goddess around it, the Egyptians offering wine to the god of the afterlife. Across the whole planet, wherever we find the earliest evidence of people deliberately making alcohol, we find the same thing right beside it. Ritual, the sacred, death, and the mystery of what comes after. That is not a coincidence. There is clearly something about the way a drink softens the edges of ordinary experience, a kind of doorway towards something bigger than yourself. We did not invent alcohol to numb ourselves after a hard day of prehistoric labor. We discovered it, and then we lifted it up and used it to mark the moments that mattered most, which brings us, finally, all the way back to you, because every single one of those ancient instincts is still alive tonight, sitting quietly inside the most ordinary things you do. And once you see it, you will never raise a glass the same way again. So look at your own life for a second, because this is where 10 million years lands, right in your living room. Think about the last time you were at a wedding. At some point, the noise dies down, someone stands up, taps a glass, and everyone reaches for theirs. Nobody teaches you to do this. You just know. When the toast comes, you lift your drink toward the people you love, and for one strange, warm moment, a room full of separate individuals feels like a single thing. That is not a party trick. That is a Natufian in a burial cave 13,000 years ago doing the exact same thing, with the exact same instinct, same ritual, nicer glassware. It's everywhere. Once you start looking, think about New Year's Eve, when a whole country counts down together and you raise a glass. The instant the clock turns, exactly the way ancient people marked the turning of a season. Think about a funeral or the quiet gathering after, where people pour a drink and tell stories about someone who's gone, honoring the dead with alcohol, quite literally, the oldest use of it we have ever found. And it's not always solemn. Think about the roar in a stadium when the home team wins, or a Friday after a brutal week, when the first cold sip feels like the day letting go of your shoulders. In every one of those moments, you are doing something profoundly old, using a drink to say, this moment matters. We are in this together. Here's the part that should genuinely move you. None of this is really about the alcohol. What your brain is actually chasing is the meaning, the connection, the sense that time has stopped for a second, that something important is happening, and you are sharing it with others. That craving, that pull toward a shared moment made sacred, is older than farming, older than writing, older than your entire civilization. You inherited it from hunter-gatherers who brewed beer for their dead, from Sumerians who worshipped a goddess, from Egyptians who sent their kings, into the afterlife with labeled wine, and from a line of curious primates, chasing the smell of ripe fruit through the forest. Every one of those links is still inside you. It didn't fade. It just changed its clothes. The cave became a kitchen, the clay cup, a wine glass, but the impulse behind it never moved an inch. So the next time you reach for a glass, not to get drunk, but to celebrate, to grieve, to welcome someone, or to say goodbye, notice what's really happening. You are not just having a drink. You are performing one of the oldest human rituals there is, a ceremony so ancient that we were practicing it. Before we had cities, before we had crops, before we could even write down what we were doing, you are the newest link in a chain that runs unbroken for 13,000 years. And behind that, 10 million more. So, when did ancient humans really start drinking? The honest answer is long before we were fully human at all. It began as a lucky accident up in the trees, and it slowly became one of the deepest rituals we have. And here's what that leaves you with. The next time you raise a glass, you are not just toasting the moment in front of you. You are joining a line of people that runs back 13,000 years, every one of them reaching for the same small piece of meaning that you are. If that thought gives you a little chill, good. That's kind of the whole point. And if you're now quietly wondering, what other ordinary habits of yours are secretly this ancient, you're in luck, because that's exactly the rabbit hole we live in around here. So stick around. There is a whole prehistoric story hiding inside your everyday life, and we are only just getting started. See you in the next one. And if you're the kind of person who loves finding the ancient story quietly tucked inside everyday life, consider sticking around and subscribing, because it's the easiest way to make sure the next one finds its way to you.